They said Jonah McCrae buried his heart the day he laid his wife beneath a frozen spruce on the ridge. Folks whispered he'd never love again, that grief in Wyoming winters would hollow him out for good. But they were wrong. One stormy night, when wind clawed at his cabin walls like a ghost begging in vain, the girl he once rescued, the one the world called worthless, stood trembling yet unbroken before the man who'd sold her like cattle. He sneered, "You think that bastard can take my place?" She looked him dead in the eye. "This child already has a father, and it isn't you." That night, Jonah chose mercy over loneliness and found family he never thought he'd deserve. Jonah McCrae hadn't meant to stay long in Willow Creek. He'd hitched his old mule at the edge of the trading stalls just after sunrise, boots crunching frost-bitten dirt, the smell of cold iron and sawdust heavy in his nose. He needed nails, maybe salt, nothing more. Nothing that would tether him to the noise and questions of town life. Folks still whispered when they saw him. There he is, the widower who buried his heart up on the ridge. He caught the low voices as he passed the grain barrels, voices that tried to sink back into shadows when he looked up. Some traders gave him that pitying nod, the kind that made him want to spit. Lost her in the dead of winter, didn't he? Dug the grave himself, they say. Others kept their distance altogether, like his grief might stick to their skin if they got too close. He tugged his collar tighter, feeling the wind slip in through the seams of his old wool coat. He wondered, not for the first time, if Joanne's grave still looked the same, if the frozen spruce above her was still strong enough to bear all that weight. He hadn't been up there in weeks. Too much to mend at the cabin, too much to keep his hands busy so the memories stayed quiet. Jonah stopped by the smithy, fingers tracing the rusted nails laid out on a battered plank. He didn't hear the argument at first, not until a bottle smashed somewhere near the livestock pen. Then a voice slurred and raw from drink. $2, I said. She's strong enough to sweep a floor and chop weeds. He turned, the hammer's price forgotten. Mabel Quinn's breath frosted at her lips, but she didn't shiver. She learned that shivering gave him something to bark about, said it made her look weak, or worse, ungrateful. So she stood with her arms crossed tight under the oversized shawl, her hair half tucked under a bonnet that smelled of old soap and stale sweat. It was her father's voice ringing through the cold, a voice that had once sung her lullabies, back when her mother was alive and the world was less cruel. Now his coat was threadbare, the sleeves stiff with dirt. He leaned against the fence rail like a man peddling mules. But Mabel knew who the mule was. She's 16, eats little, don't talk back. Won't be no trouble unless you let her rest too long, he called out, scanning the rough cluster of traders gathered round. A few men laughed, boots scuffing the frozen mud. One of them spat near her shoes like testing to see if she'd flinch. Mabel didn't look up. If she met their eyes, they'd see the small spark left inside her, the tiny flicker she'd hidden from the nights when he threw chairs or fists, and from the dawn he'd told her, "You're worth more sold than fed." She pressed her palms to the sides of her skirt, twisting the coarse fabric until the skin on her knuckles burned. Jonah stood just behind the barrels now, watching. At 42, he'd seen men do worse. He'd seen neighbors starve out in bad winters, and mothers trade silver lockets for bread they'd never taste. The war had shown him plenty of ways to break a person, some fast, some slow. But watching a father sell his own blood, that would never sit right in his gut. The trader next to him leaned close, voice low. "Don't stare too long, McCrae. That one's trouble. Cursed, maybe." Jonah said nothing. His eyes stayed on the girl's shoulders. How they jerked when the father shoved her forward, like he might make her speak for herself. But she didn't. She only stared at the dirt, eyes shadowed beneath that bonnet, her whole body braced like a tree taking one more winter it shouldn't survive. The father barked at the crowd again. $2 or a sack of oats? Who wants her? A man with a flask stepped forward, waving it like an offer. The girl's shoulders twitched. Her father laughed, slapped her arm, and belched a word that made Jonah's stomach twist. He saw it then. Saw Joanne's grave and the girl's hunched back. Saw the frozen spruce above that patch of earth, the roots that had split when he dug too deep. He remembered the last words Joanne had whispered through cracked lips. "If you ever find a soul worth saving, don't you turn away, Jonah." He didn't remember moving his feet. He only remembered the clink of coins in his palm, the weight of the last silver piece he'd sworn he'd never spend. He stepped out from the shadow of the barrels. The father's eyes narrowed as Jonah's boots hit the frozen mud. "You buying or rescuing, Mr. McCrae? Makes a difference to me." Jonah didn't answer. He just let the coins drop one by one into the man's filthy hand, like dropping stones into a grave he'd already dug. When the father snatched the money and staggered away, the crowd thinned as quickly as it had gathered. Nobody cared to watch the end of the trade. Nobody cared that the girl stayed frozen to the spot, her arms crossed like she'd hold herself together by sheer will. Jonah held out his coat, voice low as the Wyoming wind. "You'll freeze before we reach the ridge," he said. "Put this on." She didn't look at him. Not yet. But her fingers, cracked and raw, reached for the wool like it was the only warmth left in a world that had sold her cheap. And in that moment, Jonah McCrae felt something shift. A faint pulse beneath the frost, like maybe his heart hadn't stayed buried with Joanne after all. The cabin welcomed them with a hush so complete it almost made Mabel Quinn flinch. Outside, the wind clawed at the shutters, but inside there was only the crackle of pine logs in the stove and the faint smell of ash, salt, and old herbs. The first night, she didn't sit at the table until Jonah pulled the chair out for her. She perched on the edge like she expected to be kicked back onto the snow any second. Jonah ladled thin venison stew into a cracked clay bowl, slid it toward her, then settled against the counter. Arms folded, face in shadow. He didn't ask where she'd come from or how she'd ended up standing in that market with bruises like finger marks under her sleeves. He only said, "Eat while it's warm." Mabel held the spoon awkwardly in both hands, wrists trembling. She'd eaten in barns before, on doorsteps, behind saloon kitchens that locked her out when the cook got drunk. This was the first meal in months that wasn't handed out with curses or a backhanded slap for spilling. The stew was watery, too salty. She ate every drop. That first night, she curled up on a narrow cot in the corner room, under a blanket that smelled faintly of pine soap and something else. Something soft and human, maybe a memory of a woman who once called this place home. Jonah's footsteps outside her door creaked on the warped floorboards. Once she heard him pause as if he might knock, then he moved on. When sleep came, it was shallow. Mabel woke every hour, listening for her father's barked threats that never came. She pressed her palms over the bruises on her ribs, feeling them throb like secrets trying to break loose. But each time she peeked out into the hallway, there was only Jonah's broad back hunched near the fire, the flicker of a candle on his rough-cut table, and the low murmur of a voice that didn't reach her. Jonah McCrae could not remember the last time silence filled him up like this. When Joanne was alive, they'd sat at that same table in easy quiet, letting the wind chatter at the windows while they planned how many rows of potatoes to plant or whether the roof would hold another season of snow. Now the same hush pressed on his ribs like a hand from the grave. He dreamed that first night, half dreams that drifted up from the floorboards. Joanne standing by the hearth, apron smeared with flour. Joanne humming as she poured water into the chipped tin kettle, her voice softer than the storm outside. "If you ever find a soul worth saving, don't you turn away, Jonah." Awam. But when he woke, there was no warm hand on his shoulder, no answer for the question that needled him. Would she forgive him for trying to build warmth from someone else's ruin? The days found their rhythm, slow as the snow melt. Mabel rose before dawn, sweeping the pine dust from the corners of the cabin. She moved careful as a stray cat, shoulders hunched, eyes flicking toward Jonah each time she passed him by the stove. The broom handle slipped through her raw palms twice before she learned to hold it steady. When she tried to feed the fire, she burned her knuckles, muffled a cry, and wrapped her sleeve around the red mark before Jonah could see. He noticed anyway. The next morning, he laid a tin of bear grease on the table without a word. She stared at it for a long while before tucking it into her apron pocket like a secret. Some days, the cold bit harder than it should for late autumn. Jonah showed her how to haul water from the creek, how to skim the thin ice with a hatchet before filling the dented bucket. Her fingers turned stiff and red, but she kept going until the metal stung her raw skin. When she slipped on the creek's edge and soaked her boots, Jonah didn't scold. He only nudged the bucket closer with his boot, held out a hand to help her balance. One afternoon, Jonah found her by the hearth, striking a flint the wrong way over a damp pile of moss. Smoke drifted, then died with a hiss. She drew her sleeve across her eyes, fighting tears that burned hotter than the sparks she couldn't coax alive. He crouched beside her, rough hands closing around her small ones. Not to hold her down, but to guide. "You strike it like this," he murmured, voice low as the embers behind them. He pressed her fingers over the flint in the steel, angled her wrist. The spark caught, crackled, flared bright on dry moss. For a moment the glow danced across her bruised cheekbones, warming places that had been cold far too long. She didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. Her shoulders eased, just enough. Night stayed quiet, but the hush turned from brittle to soft. Jonah sat by the stove, whittling a scrap of pine into a shape his fingers remembered. A tiny cradle, edges rounded smooth. He told himself it was just something to keep his hands busy, to keep the old ghost from rattling inside his chest. But every time he glanced at the cot where Mabel slept, curled up with his old quilt pulled to her chin, he felt the doubt sink in like a thorn. Did Joanne see him now? Would she call him selfish for wanting warmth to fill this cabin again? Or would she tell him what she'd always whispered when the snow piled high on the windowsills? If there's kindness left in you, give it. If there's love left in you, don't let it rot. Outside, the wind carried the promise of the first big snow. Inside, Mabel laid another log on the fire, careful this time not to scorch her palms. Jonah met her eyes just for a heartbeat. No words, just a slow nod, the closest either of them had come to saying, "We're still here. We're trying." And that, for now, was enough. The first word of Orson Pike's return arrived on the wind before the snow even thawed. Mabel heard the neighbor's wagon driver mutter it outside the trading post. "Saw Pike up by the ridge. Bought himself a new coat. Looks like he's riding high again." She felt it in her bones that night as she stirred the kettle over Jonah's stove. Her hand trembled just slightly over the iron pot, steam curling up and stinging her eyes. She told herself it was only the chill that made her shiver. Orson Pike rode into Jonah's clearing on a gray morning, the snow half melted into mud ruts. His horse was sleek, better fed than he'd ever bothered to keep Mabel. The coat he wore was fine wool, collar trimmed in worn fur. He swung down from the saddle like he owned the place, boots sinking into the thaw. Mabel stood in the doorway, her shawl wrapped tight over the gentle swell of her belly. The life inside her kicked as if it could sense the storm waiting outside. Jonah was stacking kindling by the porch, his broad shoulders hunched forward, back turned to Pike. But Mabel saw the way his neck stiffened. Orson's grin was thin, lips cracked by whiskey and wind. "Mabel," he drawled, pulling his gloves off one finger at a time. "You look well." She said nothing, didn't invite him in, didn't offer him warmth. She just held the doorframe with white knuckles, bracing herself the same way she'd braced for his drunken rages years ago. "I thought I'd check on you," he continued, voice oily smooth. "Word in town is you've been shacked up here with a good widower. Folks say he's got you sweeping floors, feeding chickens. That true?" Jonah stood up then, turned slow, the hatchet still in his hand, not raised, just resting at his side like a promise he didn't need to speak. Orson's eyes flicked to Jonah, then back to Mabel's belly. "Funny thing," he said, stepping closer to the porch. "No one ever told me you were carrying my child when you ran. Seems I should have a say, don't you think? Maybe it's time I took you back. Did right by you and the babe." Mabel let out a breath that burned in her throat. The wind rattled the pine trees behind him. "You never asked if I was safe," she said, voice sharp as a broken bottle. "You never cared if I lived or died." Orson's smirk twitched. "I care now. It's my blood, ain't it? Can't have my own kin raised by some old man living in the woods." He spat the word old, like it might make Jonah flinch. But Jonah didn't flinch. He stepped onto the porch boards, boots creaking, the hatchet now hooked loosely in his belt. No gun drawn, no loud threat, just the weight of his presence. A man who'd dug graves and split storms alone for years. A man who'd learned that real protection didn't come from bullets, but from standing still when others ran. The wind carried Orson's voice down the slope. The neighbor's boy, chopping wood a field away, heard enough to run back to town with half the story. By sundown, whispers flickered through Willow Creek like brush fire. Jonah McCrae's taken in Pike's girl. Fool thinks he can raise another man's bastard. Some folks called Jonah soft, said grief had rotted his judgment. Others tipped their hats in quiet respect. A few women in town spoke Mabel's name in hushed sympathy, remembering how she'd come to church once with bruises she claimed were just a fall. On the porch, Orson climbed the first step, voice turning mean. "She's mine, McCrae. The brat's mine too. You think you can keep her here, safe and pretty, while I rot down in town? You think you can raise my child like it's yours?" Jonah looked at him, nothing but the crackle of kindling in his eyes. "Go home, Orson," he said, voice low and steady as the ridge behind him. "A man doesn't get to claim what he threw away." Orson's cheeks flushed red. He leaned forward, breath sour. "You think you're better than me? You think your dead wife would want this? You shacking up with a whore?" Before the word could settle, Mabel stepped down beside Jonah. She wasn't shaking now. Her voice came out fierce, splintered like old timber, but stronger for it. "You sold me like cattle, Orson Pike. You lost your right to this child the day you turned your back. This child already has a father, and it isn't you." For a second, the clearing held its breath. Orson's fists balled at his sides. Jonah didn't reach for the hatchet. He didn't need to. The wind did the talking, rattling the cabin door behind them, pushing Orson's fine coat flat against his ribs like it might strip him bare. Orson's eyes flicked from Mabel's belly to Jonah's unmoving silhouette. His sneer faded. He spat into the mud at Mabel's feet, then swung back onto his horse without another word. The hooves cracked frozen puddles as he rode out, shoulders hunched, hat low. They watched until the trees swallowed him whole. Mabel felt her knees wanting to give, but Jonah's hand found her back, warm and steady. No shots fired, no grand shouts. Just a promise nailed to the cabin walls as firm as any plank he'd ever hammered. "You're safe here. No one's taking you back." But deep in the pines, the wind still carried Orson Pike's threat. The echo of a coward's pride, sharp enough to cut when they least expected. But out there, beyond the pines, Orson Pike's ghost of pride still waits. And some say one day it might come back to test what mercy really costs. Mabel leaned into Jonah's shoulder, eyes burning. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. Out here on this quiet ridge, mercy was loud enough. The storm came on a Tuesday night, rolling in with a growl that rattled the cabin's shutters like bones in a box. By dusk, snow clawed at the eaves, and the wind howled down the ridge the way wolves used to when Jonah McCrae was a younger man, with dreams he thought winter couldn't touch. But winter touched everyone. It always did. Inside, Jonah worked by lantern light, stacking more firewood near the stove. He caught Mabel's reflection in the cabin window. She stood by the hearth, one hand pressed against the small of her back, the other cradling the heavy round of her belly. Sweat beaded her forehead despite the cold leaking in through every crack. Jonah's hands paused on the logs, and for a moment he saw Joanne standing there instead. Joanne on that night so many years ago. The night her scream had split the storm. He'd knelt beside her then, helpless as the blood soaked through the quilts. He'd felt her hand go cold before dawn, her last breath caught in his beard as he pressed his cheek to hers and whispered every prayer he knew. None of it had mattered. The baby, the miracle they'd waited so long for, had gone quiet before it ever cried. Now the echoes threatened to crush him. He felt his throat close, dry as old wood. Mabel gasped behind him, and the memory shattered like ice under boot heels. She gripped the back of the chair so tight her knuckles bleached white. "It's starting," she said, voice raw. Jonah turned, hauling water from the kettle. He set it to boil again, grabbed every rag and blanket they had left, spread them over the rough table. No midwife, no doctor, just him, two calloused hands, and a promise buried somewhere beneath his ribs. Outside, the wind screamed down the ridge. Inside, Mabel's first cry of pain rose to meet it, a thin, fierce sound that snapped every ghost out of the shadows. Jonah knelt at her side, his palm bracing her shoulder, his other hand steadying the damp hair plastered to her brow. "Stay with me now," he murmured. His voice came out hoarse, but it was solid. "You're not alone. I swear it." Hours folded into hours, the world shrinking to a single room and the dull roar of wind beyond the door. Mabel's breathing came in gasps, broken by curses she spat into her sleeve. Once, she tried to shove Jonah away, her fear boiling up hotter than the water he kept ladling. But when the next pain came, her hand reached for his and didn't let go. He held it like it was the only thing keeping him alive too. Between her cries, Jonah felt his mind slip back to Joanne. The spruce tree on the ridge, snow drifting down to cover the crude stone marker he'd carved with his hunting knife. He remembered standing there, boots sinking into the frozen earth, whispering to the raw wound in the ground. "I'll never let myself hope again." But hope was louder than vows made to dead trees. Near dawn, the wind cracked a shutter loose. Jonah barely heard it over Mabel's final scream, a cry that seemed to drag the storm into her lungs and spit it out in defiance. She collapsed against the pillows, chest heaving, eyes glazed with exhaustion. Then a sound so small he almost missed it. A wail, high and thin, like the first bird song of spring fighting through a blizzard. Jonah stared, breath caught halfway in his throat. In the cradle of Mabel's arms lay the child. Tiny, red-faced, her fists balled up as if she was ready to punch the world that had tried so hard to bury her before she even arrived. Mabel sobbed out a laugh, part relief, part wonder. She looked up at him through damp strands of hair. "Sadie Quinn McCrae," she whispered. "That's her name." Jonah sank to his knees beside them. He touched the baby's small foot, softer than the dawn light creeping through the warped window. He felt warmth pulse up his fingertips, into his chest, to the place that had been empty for so long he'd forgotten what a heartbeat felt like. He wanted to say Joanne's name, wanted to tell Mabel that the grave up on the ridge no longer felt so cold. But all he managed was a rough, broken confession that came out like a prayer. "She's everything you deserve. Everything I didn't think I'd ever deserve again." Mabel rested her cheek on Sadie's head, her eyes closing as the baby's tiny cries quieted into soft hiccups. "No more ghosts, Jonah," she murmured. "No more graves." Outside, the storm battered itself against the logs and tin roof, desperate to find a crack wide enough to steal this fragile warmth. But inside the cabin, the fire glowed bright, the smell of fresh pine and boiled cloth pushing back the shadows. Jonah sat cross-legged on the floor, back against the hearth. Mabel leaned into him, Sadie bundled tight in her arms, the baby's breath soft and steady between them. No blood on the floorboards this time, no cold hand falling slack in his grasp. The old man who'd buried his heart beneath a frozen spruce felt it now, the truth rising like heat through his ribs. Mercy had roots deeper than grief. Hope could bloom in any storm if you dared hold it close enough. Jonah laid a hand on Sadie's tiny back, the other wrapped around Mabel's shaking shoulders. The wind screamed and rattled the shutters in fury, but it found no way in. In that hush between the howling gusts, a family sat bound together not by blood, but by the simple, stubborn choice to stay. And for the first time in years, Jonah McCrae did not dream of graves, only of spring. Maybe what Jonah McCrae did all those years ago still matters now. Maybe it reminds us that family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's the kindness we give when the world says someone isn't worth saving. Sometimes it's the warmth we offer a stranger at our door, or the mercy we choose when it would be easier to turn away. In today's world, with so much noise and division, stories like Jonah's and Mabel's feel even more important. How many of us still carry old grief like a frozen weight, afraid to hope again? How many children out there, right now, need someone to stand in the doorway when the wind claws at their walls? Maybe you know someone who's lost and needs that second chance. Or maybe you are that someone, and this is your reminder that storms don't last forever if you have one hand to hold through the night. Some folks say mercy makes you weak. But what if it's the strongest thing we've got left? What if family is not just who we're born to, but who we choose when it matters most? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Would you do what Jonah did? Do you believe in second chances when the world says no? Share your story or your lesson in the comments. You never know who might need it. If you've lived long enough to know what it means to choose family over pride, share that wisdom below. Someone younger might just need it. If this tale touched your heart, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and join us for more Wild West stories about hope, courage, and the power of choosing love when it's hardest. Thank you for riding with us tonight.